Here we are at Shoreditch High Street, and we're advancing into Morrison's Old Jago through Boundary Passage. It's a narrow inlet, about 10 foot wide, and going inside we see 3 posts in front of us, 3 iron posts, sometimes cannons in Nelson's fleet, brought back and used as horse posts. Of course, they're a natural obstacle to anybody pursuing any thief or burglar, pursuing them into the Jago.
The Jago, a corner of the East End which 90 years ago was the blackest pit in London, a way of life captured in a classic novel by Arthur Morrison. The Jago, compiled and presented by Andrew Whitehead, with social historians Raphael Samuel, Stan Newens MEP, and William Fishman, an East Londoner who has written extensively on the area.
No policeman dare enter here alone past this passageway because he could disappear possibly forever. But so generally what you got was a posse of cops coming in here pursuing some burglar or thieves who used to have their victims in the markets, the open markets at Shoreditch High Street.
Boundary Passage is the approach to the site of what was one of East London's most notorious criminal slums. It's the alley which Arthur Morrison chose as the setting of the opening of his novel, A Child of the Jago.
It was past the mid of a summer night in the old Jago. The narrow street was all the blacker for the lurid sky, for there was a fire in a farther part of Shoreditch, and the welkin was an infernal coppery glare. Below the hot, heavy air lay a rank oppression on the contorted forms of those who made for sleep on the pavement. And in it, and through it all, there rose from the foul earth and the grimed walls a close, mingled stink, the odour of the Jago. From where off Shoreditch High Street a narrow passage set across with posts gave menacing entrance to an end of Old Jago Street. There, the Jago, for 100 years the blackest pit in London. Old Jago Street lay black and close under the quivering red sky, and slinking forms, as of great rats, followed one another quickly between the posts in the gut by the High Street, and scattered over the Jago.
Going forward into the heart of the old slum ghetto, called by Morrison the Jago, but known universally at the time as the Old Nichol urban slum. Here we have the Old Nichol street in front of us. It's rather wider than it was because in those days the Jago consisted of a network of slum alleyways, a few main streets consisting of 1 or 2 storied Victorian cottages built in the 1840s and 50s, dilapidated, leprous-coloured open middens, cellars where these troglodytes slept or kept their booty. Now, this Jago is recorded by a famous priest who lived amongst the urban poor. His name was the Reverend Osborne J. And he recorded for posterity the lifestyle of this infamous Old Nichol in the 1880s. He had chosen to come here voluntary, as he says, to this Shoreditch parish of 8,000 people with a death rate 4 times that of the rest of London, with 17 public houses and no church of any kind at all. A parish with a record of criminality which none could surpass or even equal. A parish which was described in the newspaper as the sink of London, worse than the barbarian.
A woman, gripping a shawl about her shoulders, came furtively along from the posts, with a man walking in her tracks, a little unsteadily. He was not of the Jago, but a decent young workman by his dress. The sight took Kiddo Cook's idle eye, And when the couple had passed, he said meditatively, "There's Billy Leary in luck again. Oh, his missus do pick 'em up, so help me. I'd carry the cosh myself if I'd got a woman like her." In a little while, something large and dark was pushed forth from the door opening near Jago Row, which Billy Leary's spouse had entered. The thing rolled over and lay tumbled on the pavement, for a time unnoted. A man it was, with a thick smear across his face and about his head, the source of the dark trickle that sought the gutter deviously over the broken flags. The drab stuff of his pockets peeped out here and there in a crumpled bunch, and his waistcoat gaped where the watch guard had been.
Arthur Morrison was born in Poplar in East London, his father an engine fitter. He was in his early 30s when he published a collection of short stories about life in the East End, to which he gave the title Tales of Mean Streets. The local priest William Fishman mentioned, Osborne J., was impressed by the book and invited the young author to visit his parish. The two became firm friends. Morrison was inspired by the vitality J had brought to the Jago, building a church there, opening a club, organising boxing matches, and winning the confidence, or at least the respect, of local residents. Through J, Morrison got to know some of the people of the area. He took a very serious-minded approach to gathering material for A Child of the Jago. He believed the story of life there must be presented with austerity and frankness. He prefaced the novel with a very accurate street map. His theme, he stated, was that of violence and despair.
There must be no sentimentalism, no glossing over. Whosoever is too young, too old, or too weak to fight must keep what he has well hidden in the Jago.
Stan Newens was born just down the road in Bethnal Green. He's now Labour member of the European Parliament for London Central.
One of my great-great-grandfathers and his son, my great-grandfather on my mother's side, lived in the Old Nichol, or the Jago. My great-grandfather, James Thomas Sheen, who was born in 1843 and who lived until 1936, whom I actually knew when I was very young, brought up a family of 9 sons and a daughter there. They all lived in a house with 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down, one of which my great-grandfather used as an upholstery workshop. He used to take his products out in a horse and van and every night walk the horse through the passage to the backyard where it was kept. He was converted to Christianity by a great storm in the 1860s and remained a dedicated member of the Salvation Army throughout his life.
Salvation Army uniforms would have been a familiar sight in the Jago when Arthur Harding was born there in the late 1880s. Harding would have been about 9 when Morrison's novel was published. A fly-by-night, a jack of all trades, he lived into his 90s.
We had one small room in a 3-storey tenement which contained 12 rooms let to 12 different families. There was a basement which was supposed to be for a wash house for washing dirty linen. But as it was in complete darkness, it was only used by homeless people at night as a shelter from the cold. The yard was only about 12 foot wide, just enough to put the dustbins each side. The water tap on each landing was 3 or 4 stairs below the level of the floor, and it was in a sort of alcove. The rent wasn't very expensive at all, about 3 shillings a week for a room.
Arthur Harding was one of my constituents, and I first came into contact with him when I was the Member of Parliament for Epping. He wrote to me about a problem and then subsequently asked me to read his autobiography, which I did, and I discovered that he was a remote relative of mine by marriage. In fact, he married a niece of one of my great aunts. Now, I discovered when we actually went into studying his life that my paternal grandfather, who was an East End policeman, actually arrested him on one occasion before the First World War during one of his escapades. Well, eventually I introduced Raphael Samuel to Arthur Harding, and then Raph himself decided that he could get a great deal more out of Arthur Harding by tape recordings and so on. And in fact, the book which was produced in many ways was quite different from the original book which Arthur Harding wrote.
Unfortunately, in the manuscript that Arthur had written, he was concerned with his battles with the police in later life, and he didn't really have an account of his childhood except the one he'd taken himself from the books of the time, like Arthur Morrison. So I spent about 2 or 3 years trying to force him to remember the early years of his childhood, the first 8 years of his life, when he lived in the Jago before he was sent away to Dr. Barnardo's home.
The Nichol was something like a ghetto. A stranger wouldn't chance his arm there, but to anyone brought up in it, every alley was familiar. The Nichol was a place on its own. You didn't go into any other territory. You could go into the cake shop and say, "Got any broken biscuits, mister?" Or into the pudding shop and ask for a pie crust, or say, "Got any cold pudding?" And they'd say, "How much have you got?" And you'd say, "A halfpenny." "All right," they said, "give us that," because they knew you. There was hardly any traffic. The children could go anywhere and have no fear of nothing. The coal carts didn't go fast. The chimney sweeps, now, they knew everybody. And so the result was that it was a close-knit community, and everybody knew everybody.
Arthur Harding was born in 1887. In other words, he was born in the very last years of the Nichol, just before the clearances began 3 years later. The time that he was sent to Dr. Barnardo's is about the time when the clearance of the Nichol was finished. So I reckon that he would be probably the last man alive who had lived there, and it just seemed magical that, as it were, a voice from a dead past, from allegedly the most dangerous bit of late Victorian London, that a voice from that past was there.
Raphael Samuel, a tutor in social history at Ruskin College, Oxford, pieced together Arthur Harding's life story in East End Underworld. Harding was just about a contemporary of Morrison's young hero, Dicky Perrott. Dicky's father, Josh, was once a plasterer. During the course of the novel, he's unemployed, supporting the family, when he's a mind to, with the proceeds of coshings and robberies. Josh Perrott ends up on the gallows. Morrison asks the question, what chance does Dicky Perrott have of making good when all he knows is Jago ways? And he also takes the opportunity of cocking a snook at those philanthropists and social reformers who sought to tame or civilise the East End without confronting the bitter realities of life there.
Dicky Perrott had found the cake. It was in a much smaller room at the back of the hall, wherein it was expected that the bishop and certain eminences of the platform would refresh themselves with tea. Filling the room and standing about in little groups, not a soul of them all perceived an inconsiderable small boy, ducking and dodging vaguely among legs and round skirts, making, from time to time, a silent snatch at a plate on the table. And presently he vanished altogether. Then the amiable bishop, beaming over the teacup 6 inches from his chin at 2 courtiers of the clergy, bethought him of a dinner engagement, and passed his hand downward over the rotundity of his waistcoat. "Dear, dear," said the bishop, glancing down suddenly. "Why, what's become of my watch?" There hung 3 inches of black ribbon with a cut end. The bishop looked blankly at those worthies about him. 3 streets off, Dicky Perrott, with his shut fist deep in his breeches pocket and a gold watch in the fist, ran full drive for the old Jago.
Kids always had a sharp penknife with them, and they'd work those shops that left things outside. They'd nick anything that was small. Little kids' rubber shoes that was about $1 a pair of boots from outside the shop. They used to have them hanging on a string. Little girls' things like socks. Children would also steal from the oil shops. They'd go in and say, "A pint of paraffin oil." The man had to go out the back because they were duty bound to keep the oil right out the back as a safeguard. And while he was off, out went Charlie with whatever he'd pinched. A scrubbing brush, a broomhead, all that kind of thing. Even a small saucepan and a pail. Very saleable stuff. Those things are always useful at home.
Arthur himself actually went snatching and made his escape through the posties. He went thieving from the fruit barrows in Shoreditch High Street and made his getaway through that little alley, which is still there, and which is the posties in Arthur Morrison's novel, so that topographically, and even in the use that those streets were put to for getaways, Arthur Harding confirms at least the partial truth of Morrison's account. On the other hand, in the most fundamental way, it subverts it, partly because he reminds you that crime was not a separate activity, that actually the Jago's great industry was not cosh carrying, but the making of cheap furniture.
Morrison didn't wish to suggest that all the East End was like the Jago. He chose to write about the area precisely because of its notoriety. But the picture he paints of crime, violence, prostitution was unremittingly bleak. Too bleak indeed for some reviewers.
The inhabitants of the Jago can no more be regarded as true to life than the Houyhnhnms. I'm not surprised that many who know the East End well have protested against this picture given by Arthur Morrison.
Luckily, I need not vindicate my accuracy. That has been done for me publicly by independent and altogether indisputable authority. In particular, the devoted vicar of the parish, which I have called the Jago, has testified quite unreservedly to the truth of my presentation. Others also, with special knowledge, have done the same. And though I refer to them and am grateful for their support, it is with no prejudice to the validity of my own authority. For not only have I lived in the East End of London, which one may do and yet never see it, but observation is my trade.
Arthur Morrison's novel undoubtedly reflects very, very accurately indeed one aspect of the life in the Old Nichol and in the East End as a whole. There was a population which eked out a miserable existence on the edge of casual labour and crime, and undoubtedly these people existed, and Arthur Morrison describes them very, very accurately indeed. However, there were other people who regarded themselves as part of the respectable working class, who were particularly influenced by the Salvation Army and other religions at the time, who shunned drink and who tried to lead a respectable life, and they were quite unlike the characters described by Arthur Morrison.
It is a monstrous and at points absurd libel on the people of the Nichol. Let me give you an example. Bethnal Green and Hoxton were famous for what one might describe as honest crime. To say, safe cracking or robbing. It was not a district of sexual vice at all. In fact, going through the newspapers, you find absolutely no cases of prostitution in that area at all, unlike highly respectable parts of London like, say, St John's Wood or Mayfair. When Morrison says, in other words, that cosh carrying was near to being a major industry in the Jago, that's nonsense. That's not sensationalism, it's pure invention.
Not only did Morrison gain a lot of his information through Father J, he also came to share his outlook on the criminal poor. J believed the best thing that could happen to the Jago was that it be utterly destroyed. As for the unredeemable among its residents, he proposed penal settlements where the inmates would live out the rest of their lives, unable to propagate more of their kind. J wrote 3 books about his work in Shoreditch, but his most conspicuous success, Raphael Samuel argues, was as a self-publicist.
What Jay was doing is something which was common for clergymen in slum parishes in East London, but also in other places like Bermondsey and indeed in cathedral slums in the provinces. A commonplace thing for a clergyman to do, nonconformist or Anglican, Jay was an Anglican, was to play up the viciousness or the poverty of the people of the parish in order to bring in funds. So they depicted the people not only as being poor, but also as being pagan wild beasts.
Here, underneath this massive railway arch, is Wheeler Street, which was a great goods depot for Liverpool Street Station and a magnet for the thieves of the ghetto, because here the full goods yards on the right would be full of merchandise brought here from the docks to make their way inland. And of course, it was a tradition here for the inhabitants of the Jago, particularly at night, to make their way to the vehicles and steal as much as they can. It was Tom Tiddler's ground for them.
Here, carts and vans went to and fro all day, laden with goods from the depot. And certain gangs among the Jagos preyed on these continually. A quick-witted scout stood on the lookout for such vehicles as went with unguarded tailboards. At the approach of one such, he sent the shout, "Fats a-runnin'," and quick at the signal, a gang scuttled down, seized whatever could be snatched from the cart and melted away into the courts, sometimes leaving a few hands behind to hinder and misdirect pursuit.
Somebody's been at it at the goods yard.
One thing all agree on is that the Jago was a good place to get rid of stolen goods. In Morrison's novel, the fences were located in what is now Redchurch Street.
The publicans had a dual role, not only for selling beer, they were also fences for stolen goods. And this particular street on the border of the ghetto was particularly a good location for fences, because they came in from Bethnal Green Road and would drop their stuff in the backyards of the pubs.
There were some very famous prize-fighting pubs, above all the Blue Anchor, in the Nichol, and these were venues to which the sporting fraternities would come from other parts of London. They would include people like the high mob, simply because a sporting pub was a place where a lot of money changed hands and where bets were placed. One of the accuracies of Morrison's novel is that he makes the real criminals not Jago inhabitants, but the high mob who come in from outside.
When the high mob visit the Jago to design villainies and toss for sovereigns, Beveridge, an old Jago hand, gives Dicky some advice.
Now, Dicky Perrott, you Jago whelp, look at them. Look hard. Some day, if you're clever, cleverer than anyone in the Jago now, if you're only scoundrel enough and brazen enough and lucky enough, 1 of 1,000, maybe you'll be like them, bursting with high living, drunk when you like, red and pimply. There it is. That's your aim in life. There's your pattern. Learn to read and write. Learn all you can. Learn cunning. Spare nobody and stop at nothing. And perhaps, he waved his hand towards the high mobsman, it's the best the world has for you. And that's the only way out, except the jail and the gallows. So do your devilmost, or God help you, Dicky Perrott. Though he won't, for the Jago's got ya.
Dicky has many good qualities. He's protective to his feckless mother and the succession of short-lived brothers and sisters. He rejoices when he gets a job as shop boy, but his past catches up with him and he's dismissed. There is no escape from the Jago. The novel ends in one of the perennial street fights. Dicky is chivied, stabbed, and carried away.
He was laid out in the surgery. A crowd stood about the door while Father Sturt went in. The vicar lifted his eyebrows questioningly and the surgeon shook his head. It was a matter of minutes. Father Sturt bent over and took Dicky's hand. My poor Dicky, he said. Who did this? Dunno, Father. The lie, the staunch Jago lie. Thou shalt not knock. fetch mother and the kids and father? Yes, my boy. Tell Mr. Beveridge there is another way out. Better.
By the time A Child of the Jago was published in 1896, the slum had almost ceased to exist. It was swept away in one of the first slum clearance schemes of the London County Council. The old residents of the Jago, almost all Gentiles by the way, in contrast to those areas immediately to the south, which had a large Jewish population, they moved on to pastures new.
The result of The Child of the Jago and Osborne Jay's own book led the authorities, as well as, of course, a postscript to the Jack the Ripper murders, which had only taken place 6 or 7 years before, led to the authorities to demolish the whole area, demolish this great carbuncle, this massive slum, which was a threat both through disease and through crime to the neighbouring parts of East London. And so a commission was set up and the whole place was slowly demolished. And by 1900 you have what was once a network of furted alleyways. Here you have these massive red brick buildings shaped in a circle, and in the middle they erected a marvellous bandstand, and the bands of Her Majesty's forces would play to the local residents of the Boundary Estate on Sundays.
I think that the area still is drab now. The flats which were erected on the site of the Old Nichol certainly don't appeal to me, but they were regarded as model in their day. And of course, in those circumstances, new people were moved in, and many of the older people were tended to be dispersed around the area.
The dispossessed Jagos had gone to infect the neighbourhoods across the border and to crowd the people a little closer. They did not return to live in the new barrack buildings, which was a strange thing, for the county council was charging very little more than double the rents which the landlords of the old Jago had charged. And so another Jago, teeming and villainous as the one displaced, was slowly growing in the form of a ring round about the great yellow houses.
Only a few spots on the edge of the Jago now remain to give any impression of what the area was like when Arthur Morrison first encountered it. There's Boundary Passage with its enduring posts. Redchurch Street still has its veneer shops, and some of the narrow, cobbled alleyways leading off it are much as they were. But just to the south, across Bethnal Green Road, lies the district of Spitalfields, parts of which have survived unchanged.
It's always been traditionally an area of immigrants from the pre-Huguenots through the Irish who moved into those very houses, then on to the Jews who came after the great diaspora from Russia and Poland in 1881. And nowadays it is a home of the new immigrants, the Bangladeshi. So there are houses in this area south of the Jago which have housed immigrants for 250 years. And the same houses exist. Careful. Here's some buildings, beautiful buildings over there. This is the historian's delight, although the social workers anathema. Oh, they demolished it. They've demolished these buildings here.
I have remarked in more than one place the expression of a foolish fancy that because the houses of the old Jago have been pulled down, the Jago difficulty has been cleared out of the way. That is far from being the case. The Jago, as mere bricks and mortar, is gone. But the Jago in flesh and blood still lives.
The Jago was compiled and presented by Andrew Whitehead, with contributions from William Fishman, Senior Research Fellow at Queen Mary College, London, Raphael Samuel, Tutor in Social History at Ruskin College, Oxford, and Stan Newens, Member of the European Parliament for London Central. Extracts from A Child of the Jago by Arthur Morrison were read by Steve Hodson, and Leonard Fenton read from East End Underworld by Raphael Samuel. The director was John Theocharis.